Welcome to everyone to our latest monthly webinar. As Dan just mentioned, we're recording today, so the plan is that I'll get this recording edited and up onto the website probably later this week. So if by any chance you wanted to review it at any point, it'll be there to look at, or if you want to share it with colleagues, feel free to do so. I'll try and get it up pretty quickly. Starting off today, Dan's going to be looking at the first set of accounts that are out. I think you've got 22 accounts, haven't you, Dan, that you've analysed? So that first look at what's going on with the outturn for 2021. And then we've got Simon Horsington from Rates Plus, who's going to talk to us about appeals, and particularly about the 2017 appeals, the interaction with material change in circumstances. So we'll get that sort of expert's view about what's happening with appeals. And Simon will be around afterwards from 11 o'clock onwards as well. So if you do have any questions about appeals, Simon will be there to talk about those as well. And then finally, it'll be me finishing up talking about what seems to be the eternal subject at the moment, which is when are the funding reforms going to happen? Will they hit 22, 23, or will we have to wait a bit longer? We'll get straight into it because we've got quite a lot to cover today. We will be finished by 11, and then there'll be the chat afterwards. But for now, we'll get going. So Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Adrian. Morning, everybody. So I'm going to look at the first sets of accounts that have come out, and as I posted on LinkedIn, I have my Director of Insight, which is my daughter who's at university, trolling through all the accounts. We've got all 340 odd links, and periodically she checks those links for me to see if the accounts have landed. So we're fairly confident as of Monday morning that 22 authorities have published. Some might have published since then. What we'll continue to do is pick those up and analyse them. But this is the first analysis, and stress it is fairly early analysis. But what it does show is some really interesting trends that are coming out this year. So there's other areas that I want to do more work on, but I don't feel like 22 authorities is enough to make any definitive conclusions at the moment. But we're going to share with you what we found so far. So if you move on one slide, Adrian. So we think 22 so far, 9 districts, 3 counties. Counties are interesting to me. I tend to, in my own life, tend to work for districts. And I know we'll talk about this in more detail in a bit with the collection fund and the Section 31 grants for the business rate reliefs, that there's some massive changes in the accounts that reflect these, that make the accounts much more difficult to analyse. And looking at those counties, I had wondered at the time that could they release this, do their collection fund journals accurately, or would it be based on estimates? And it seems from the 3 counties that have released that they've had to base it on estimates. And just looking at those estimates, I wonder whether they'll change quite significantly, because when the districts finalise their NNDR3s and their collection funds, there's such massive changes through there because of the Section 31 grants. I can't help but think that will have an impact on the counties, but we'll come to that when we get there. 2 Mets, both in the Manchester metropolitan area, I believe, 7 unitaries, and so far just the 1 London borough. I'm not going to show any specific authorities here. Some of you that have released your accounts are on the call today, and you won't be able to see yours picked out in the graph. Members of LGi will send some slides picking theirs out, and as more accounts come up, we'll be able to show them where they are. But I think hopefully what it does is gives you an idea of some of the things that are coming out of the accounts and some of the things to look out for. And I know, being responsible, partly responsible for a set of accounts myself, there are lots of questions, and it's been really helpful to look at the accounts so far to see what's coming out. I've had quite a few queries of the treatment Section 31 as well. So I'm getting quite a good view of how people are treating it. But what you'll see as well is there is some different treatments because the the figures around the rate reliefs are so massive, they have a material impact on the account. So we'll talk through how some different authorities have treated those. So if we move on, Adrian, you'll know by now that usable revenue reserves, and by that I mean the general fund balance and earmark reserves, what I tend to do is take out schools balances and housing revenue account balances, so that we're comparing like with like. But it tends to be the usable revenue reserves that are used as the main indicator, I'd say, or the leading indicator for measurement of financial resilience. And we know that because both at Northamptonshire and Croydon, when they declared Section 114, it was at the point where their usable revenue reserves were insufficient to be able to fill the gap in the structural deficit that was inside their budget, hence the Section 114. And when we analyse them, we tend to analyse absolute levels, but also the direction of travel. And that, when you look at Northamptonshire and Croydon, it was a direction of travel which had come from 5 or 6 years previously of reducing reserves. You could see why they were in the trouble that they were. So if we move on, let's have a look at a bit of the data then. So what I have here in the first instance is the usable revenue reserves as a percentage of net revenue expenditure. So that, as I said, excludes for districts HRA balances. It's just the general fund usable revenue reserves. And this was the trend previously from 14-15 to 19-20. And what's happened with districts is usable revenue reserves have steadily increased, almost in a straight line. That bottom green line shows all districts. I picked out the 9 districts that have published their accounts, and this in itself I think is interesting. And as much as I think there's a correlation, and it's the same with upper tiers, which we'll look at in a minute, the authorities that tend to have better financial health tend to are more likely to release their accounts earlier. And that, to me, sort of, I guess, I mean, this is a bit of a generalisation, smacks of that they're fairly well settled. They haven't got some of the issues taking them away from being able to get their accounts out early. So it's interesting to me that actually the early adopters tend to be the ones with the highest level of reserves, including the 2 authorities that have got the highest level of usable revenue reserves as a percentage of net revenue expenditure. So that the 9 authorities are already at a higher level. But if we move on to one slide, you'll get to see what's happened in 2021. Now that's not an ordinary year's worth of increases in reserves. That's an extraordinary increase in reserves, and that I put down to the Section 31 grants that in all districts and in most places are currently sat in earmark reserves, waiting to fund the big collection fund deficit that is set in the collection fund adjustment account. And in a minute, we'll go through some work I've done to try and marry up those figures to try and get a better view of what has really happened to reserves. So the collection fund the Section 31 grants, I think, are a big factor. There are clearly lots of other COVID factors that have been reported and that you can see. There's other COVID grants that are probably sitting in reserves that are waiting to be used. And then there's lots of reporting that some underspends are arising because of COVID, because some things just haven't got done. And I think at our last session, we ran a survey, and the majority of authorities actually said they've received more COVID funding than they've had to spend in 2021. That's not to say that they won't spend that additional funding in the future. I think most think they will. But actually, there's a perverse picture here, and we've got to be careful, I guess, as a sector, that what the picture shows is not what it is really, because a lot of these increases will disappear. Most of them will disappear next year, but over the next few years in any case. So that's the picture with the 9 districts that have published. And you see an extraordinary rise in 2021. And if you move on, Adrian. And that's the individual authorities themselves. So that's the 9 separate authorities. and with the exception of the second one there, well, even that one, you can see that they've all had those significant increases. So increases in reserves of between 23 and 85%. And in a normal year, you would expect districts, last year, for instance, a quarter of districts had a reduction in their usable revenue reserves. And then the 3 quarters that had increases ranged from modest increases to some that outliers that had big increases, but nothing of this magnitude. So everybody who's released so far has had at least a 23% increase in their level of reserves, which again points to the technical nature and the not real nature of those increases, which we'll look at as we go along. If we move on, I think we'll get on to upper tiers. So 13 upper tiers have released their accounts, and as I said, with the districts, the 13 that have their past performance, they've got tend to have higher level reserves than the average. Upper tiers are an interesting one in as much as reserves, you'll remember 3 or 4 years ago, there was quite a bit of media as reserves were plummeting in the upper tier at the same time that the biggest cuts were happening in the local government funding. The social care, adult social care crisis was becoming acute, and this was what prompted the additional precept for adult social care. And since those days, reserves have recovered significantly. But again, as you'll have seen if you've come to some of the other sessions, or if you're a member of our benchmarking service, there's still a third of upper tier authorities that are losing reserves, reducing reserves, I should say, in 1920. So there's still a real mixed picture, where there's significant amount of authorities that have still got that downward trend, but as a whole, that's come back up. And again, there's outliers. Some authorities, particularly in London, have seen quite significant improvements in their reserve levels over the period. So if we move on, we'll see what happened to the 13 authorities that have published their accounts, and yet again you can see their massive increase in reserves, which is not a real increase, but the technical nature of the COVID reliefs, which we'll move on to now. Oh, no, we'll move on to those reserves separately. If you move on one slide, Adrian. So this I think shows again, you can see where it says 1 to 7, it should actually say 14-15 to 2021, and 6 is 1920, 7 is 2021. So you can see, with the exception of that bottom line there on the right, that each and every authority has had a pretty exponential increase in their reserve levels. So again, pointing to the technical nature of that. The authority that's at the bottom, I looked at their accounts in some detail, and I can see that they've got a whopping collection fund surplus heading their way in collection fund deficit heading their way in 21-22, but I can't see the corresponding increase in their reserves or anything in their reserves that indicates that they have a whole load of COVID stuff there. So whether they've chosen to put it in the debtor creditor position or not, I'm not sure, but it feels like their treatment, I'm not saying it's incorrect, but it's not necessarily consistent with those other 12 authorities in the 9 districts. So it'll be interesting when that winds itself out to see whether that's the case, because as I look at it, all things being equal, the collection fund deficit that they'll have to fund will wipe out their reserves entirely in 21-22, but I'm sure that's not the case. So again, what you see is a picture of reserves which have technically increased, but that's not a true picture. And if we move on one, I think I've summarised that. Massive increases, and to me, mainly but not entirely due to the impact of those Section 31 grants, which we didn't anticipate at the point that we put our NNDR1s in. NNDR1s effectively set our precept for business rates, We got the money then subsequently into our general fund, which is where it sits now. Collection fund's got a huge deficit, general fund's got a huge surplus. They kind of marry off. There's other things as well. But if we move on, we've got to be aware of the following. So I saw this yesterday, and reading this, I guess it's reasonably level, but I'm not sure they've picked up on as much as they might this technical nature which I'm pointing to, and it is the MJ which is more responsible than some of the other journalistic content. But if you get a headline, Cardiff boost reserves in the middle of the pandemic, if you're inclined to not be favourable towards local government, you might see that as the authorities benefiting or profiteering from a pandemic, if you will want to read it that way. So I think it's it's slightly misleading headlines. There's a little bit more context that's provided in the detail, but I can just see this potentially becoming a headline, and one that we should probably be worried about. And that's why I think it's important to try and get to the bottom of the temporary nature of the reserves increase. So that's what I'm going to try and do now. And I've had a go at this. I put something on LinkedIn. I've had people that sort of don't particularly agree. So I'm not saying this method that I'm using now is correct, and it's probably one for us to kick around in the session afterwards if people are minded to. But very happy for people to throw in any views, because actually what I'd like to find is a consistent way, i.e. a way that I can pick from any accounts of measuring the Section 31 impact on reserves. But I'll take you through the way that I've done it. Happy to have a debate about whether that's sound or otherwise. So we're saying a significant element, I'm saying a significant element of the reserves increase is effectively the Section 31 grants that will sit in retail, hospitality and leisure. So not the grants, the reliefs. They weren't anticipated when we set an NDR1. So they'll sit in the general fund, and they will fund the collection fund deficits that are honed overnight on the 31st of March in the collection fund adjustment accounts. And you can see from the collection funds, there's massive deficits accruing in the business rates column. So in looking at some of the accounts that are published already, I'm just going to talk you through a couple of accounts and some of the treatments. If you move on one, Adrian, what I'm generally finding is if I look in earmark reserves, that I can either see the business rates equalisation reserve, which a lot of authorities have, is significantly increased, and therefore I'm assuming the COVID-19 reliefs are in there, or they've actually put a new reserve in saying COVID-19 reliefs, and you can see it was naught at the end of 1920, it's now multiple millions in 2021. But some interesting other takes which I think are really useful. I've spoken with Stephen Sheen about this as well. I'll converse by email Stephen, and he's got a view that he's recommended a certain disclosure, which I think sets it out really nicely about why the earmark reserves are much larger, and trying to remove that impact of these COVID-19 reliefs. But what you have here is one of the authorities that have chosen in their earmark reserves note to actually say collection fund timing difference. So it sits in the earmark reserves, it sits in the control total that's on the balance sheet, but they've separately identified out those reliefs that I guess they're saying will immediately passport back to the collection fund. And you can hopefully read their explanation, which marries up to the note which I've circled. And I think that's a pretty good explanation. I think that's a good attempt at explaining what's going on here, and therefore extracting out the impact on the reserves of the timing difference. I've also, to the right there, put the collection fund adjustment account extract. Now that's 98 million, whereas they've said the timing difference is 82 million. That 98 million includes everything that's gone on in the collection fund, so it'll include council tax as well. and it'll include other technical adjustments that I guess because of COVID have resulted in lower collection rates, more bad debts, etc., etc. So we aren't just looking at the impact of the timing on reserves, but also the impact of that rates and council tax has had on COVID that will feed its way through, either through lower collection rates, more write-offs, etc., etc. For me, the collection fund adjustment account balance, which I've never really thought a lot about before, is effectively what you're carrying forward, what that authority's ownership of the collection fund surplus or deficit. So the move on that, I think, is for me the important figure to capture. So that's one authority's way of doing it. If we click on, here's another authority's. Not sure whether you can read that as well, actually, because I'm struggling to read it. But it says inside their MERS, they put a general fund balance, collection fund reserve. So they've separately identified out the grant and said it's not really a resource that's available to us like other earmarked reserves. So we're separating it out in order to make it clear that this will disappear in a year's time to that collection fund deficit. And there you've got about, I can make out the 41, then my eyes blur, I think it's 41.5 million in that column. And again, looking at that authority's CFAA extract, there's 47 million in there. And again, as I said, I haven't really looked at the collection from the adjustment account in any detail before, because it tends to be a fairly small account that carries deficits or surpluses. But what I can see is that the change is that authority's share of the deficit. So a district CFAA would be 40% of whatever the change in the overall deficit on the collection fund would be. And I guess in London it'll be whatever share you guys have these days. And the GLA share and all the county shares in the district will go into the creditor debtor arrangement that you have for them in your account. So for me, those two authorities had notes that I thought were understandable, that started to get behind the explanation of the reserves increase. I've looked at quite a few others, and you can see the odd disclosure notes, you can see stuff in the narrative statement. I want to do a little bit more of a troll around those going forward. But it's still, for me, the reserve increases that are shown so substantial that I think it warrants at the very least a narrative statement section and possibly an additional disclosure as well. But I like the way that these two authorities have done it. It gives you a better sense that the reserves that are to do with the Section 31 grants aren't there as resources that are available as other earmarked reserves are. Move on one, Adrian. So as I said earlier, most of the authorities that I've looked at so far, they'll have an earmarked reserve that will say COVID-19 reliefs, or where I can't see that, I can often see a massive inflation into the business rates equalisation reserve, which I'm taking to be there. There's that one authority that said I can see the COVID grants come through their income and through their, what's it called, the other grants, the below the CIS line that's got all the government grants in it, but I can't see where it's overnighted in reserves, so I can only see it's elsewhere on the balance sheet. But there's a disconnect there between its reserves increase and its massive deficit. But if we move on, look at the analysis. So getting back to the analysis earlier, I showed you those increases. This now is just the percentage increase of the 22 authorities. Green means district, grey means upper tier. And you can see in a normal year, you would expect about a third of those to be dipping below the line because they'll have had a reserves reduction. So far, all 22 authorities have had an increase in usable revenue reserves. That isn't the natural course of events. And therefore, this adjustment has made a significant difference. And at the point where an irresponsible journalist comes in, they might take the view that what are we moaning about in local government with respect to funding? Look at how much our reserves have gone up. So getting behind this is important. So you can see there that there's a good range. Forgetting the outlier at the bottom there for a moment, every single authority so far has had at least 20% increase in their reserves. So the next graph, I think, is the important one. So, and this is up for debate. So I've removed the change in the collection fund adjustment account. So that is a proxy to me for the level of, and it's not an absolute accurate proxy, but it's the best that I can see that I could apply to any set of accounts that removes the impact of those reserves in the earmarked reserves balance that I think will disappear because of the timing difference, and also disappear because of other problems with the collection fund deficit, because I've taken the whole collection fund balance. So if I remove that from there, the result I have there, you'll see that two authorities would, without, if they had to fund collection fund adjustment account from usable reserves, they would effectively have a reduction in reserves. The rest would have a modest increase, but far more modest than the blocks that you saw previously, which are now the top of the white blocks. So to me, that gives best proxy for the change, the real change in reserves. I'd be interested if people have other views or other ways they think you could get to that proxy for real increase in reserves, because there might be more technical ways. I can't do it from just looking in the reserves because we all treat them slightly differently. I've said before, I think this was an area that whoever it is, SIC for LASAC or whatever they're called, that for me they should have put into the code for this year something that enabled us to do it consistently. This is the only way at the moment that I can see kind of tries to measure the impact, and because reserves are such an important measure, I think it's important that we try to measure the impact. So we move on. Time. A few questions there. What have you done at the last point? Most people are saying they'll put it in the narrative statement. When we asked at the last session, a smaller number are putting a separate disclosure note. For myself, I think I'd put a separate disclosure note. But I think the questions that underlie that is, can you really isolate the COVID impact on your financial position? And have you been more or less impacted than similar authorities? And hopefully our members will get to see that as we're able to show their position against all the other accounts that we dredge from the internet as and when they become available. So we move on one. So I just want to finish with some very quick observations elsewhere. The next session I'm going to do much more on capital health, but I don't feel there's enough information in from the 22 accounts to make any firm conclusions, but where I can do so is on pension deficits and investment property. So very quickly we'll go through those. Starting pension deficits, every single authority has had a significant increase in their pension deficit. And I've talked about this before. I think that I would be worried by that, but many of you guys aren't as worried. But 25% average increase in pension deficits up to someone who's doubled. And I guess the question is, will that translate to increased contributions next time the actuarial valuer comes in? I've spoken to a few people who said there isn't much of a relationship there, so they're less worried about it. But it's an interesting one. But is it a trend that is a one-off, like the reserves that will bounce back next year? So just an interesting one to put out there. But it'll be when you do your accounts, you'll get an idea of what's happening elsewhere in terms of deficit, so that whether or not you're an outlier. Move on, we should have the upper tier version of that, which is more worrying because upper tier authorities have an average increase in the pension deficit of 36%, ranging from 10 to 67%. So again, will that create a cost pressure when the valuer comes in triennially and says we need to recover our deficit, you're going to pay more contributions. I don't know. I'll leave that to others to decide. If we move on one now to investment properties, I'm doing a great deal with this at the moment, but 14 of the 23 authorities have investment properties. Again, this is one of the things that irresponsible journalism and irresponsible people who should know better have been opining on over the last few years. And my fear here is that looking at commercial properties, I think they've held up better than I thought they might have. But actually, the 13 authorities where I can see investment property notes have collectively over £2 billion in investment property, of which 87 million or 4% was wiped off in fair value adjustments. And if you move on one, you'll see that with the exception of the authority there on the right, but I think that's actually, it's just got a couple of small properties and they've gone up. Most authorities are seeing quite significant reductions in fair value. What I haven't looked at in detail yet, but I had a look at some of those bigger investment property holders, is their rental income. Rental income seems to be holding up far better than I might have thought, according to the notes. But again, we're starting to pick that data off and we'll be able to provide that. So those of you who have large portfolios will be able to see how you compare in terms of fair value write down and the strength of your income going forward. But I guess this is one that will have a fair bit of focus on it. And as I've said in the past, all we're looking for is a bit of light ahead of the heat so that people are debating on facts, not on rhetoric and opinion, which doesn't have that fact to underlie it. So I think that's it. Click on one more. Yeah. So last slide. You ought to know that I will be looking on the internet, or my daughter will be looking on the internet to get more and more accounts to be able to make these analyses more robust. And what we'll be particularly looking for, which I'll come back to at future events, is to try and get a clearer picture on financial health and resilience and the benchmarks that are coming out of this year's accounts, which enable us to do that. So that's me done. I think I'm in time there, Adrian. Pass on to Simon.
Yeah, over to you, Simon. Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Dan.
So, Adrian, do you want me to try and whip through this in maybe 10, 12 minutes?
Yeah, that's great, Simon. If you can, that's great. You've got
do my best.
Yeah,
do my best. There will be questions though, so and I should say as well that unlike what Dan's managed to do in his business, my offspring are no bloody use to me whatsoever because my son's a bloody theatre lighting director. So, although actually there's probably an argument there that he knows more about valuation than most of the valuation office. Boom, boom. Okay. My last attempt at a joke. So, is the audio and video all right for everybody? Yeah. Okay, good. So next slide, if you don't mind, Adrian. So I'm going to whip through where we sit for those of you in the finance community, who I think are most of you on the call today. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about losses and the material change of circumstance issue, which I'm assuming many of you in finance have kind of come at in a rush in the last few weeks. I hasten to add, be attempting to explain all of it in the course of this call, but if I can give you a bit of a heads up about what's going on, that is the intention. Next slide, please, Adrian. So basically, where do we sit? Well, as my job title might have given it away, my qualifications at the start, I'm a Revs and Bens boy. That's what I know about. There are effectively three of us over in the revenues and benefits market who are supplying advice to typically your revenues colleagues, those of you in billing authorities, which are entirely the customer base for the purposes of this exercise. My competitors, apart from my trading name, which is Rates Plus, my competitors are Analyse Local and Wilks Head Neve. Analyse are the most prolific in the marketplace. They've got about 100 plus sites at the moment. All of us are revenues or valuation based advisors. For my part, I used to work with Wilks Head Eve. I split from them about 18 months ago. And and I'm building the client base nicely. So I'm at 15 at the moment, disproportionate share of London and the Southeast, which I'm well happy about. And if I'm lucky, over the next 18 months, I'll give Analyze a run for their money. Now, when the MCC issue was live earlier this year, and for various reasons that I'll come to, that was particularly pronounced in London, the method that we developed with one of our London boroughs was one of two widely circulating in London, and which SLT were looking at using before the government acted to make the problem go away. Again, I'll come back to that issue in just a moment. Next slide, please, Adrian. So let's start with an easy bit then. Losses on appeals. Most of you in the billing authorities should now have access to check, challenge, appeal data. And if you complete the necessary valuation office sign-ups and authorizations, you will be able to get that data on a monthly basis, and it will help you forecast trends. There is sufficient information in most authority check challenge data now to start to do simple trend analysis, which just wasn't there 2 years ago. So if you're not signed up for that yet, if your revenues people are not signed up for that yet, then quite simply tell them to do it. All they got to do is sign the VOA disclosure agreement, and then they start getting the data. Now, having said that it will help you with trend forecasting for the purposes of the losses calculation, I have to tell you that some care is required using the VOA data for losses which have already been processed. VOA data is not well known for its credibility, and in amongst a number of errors that have been identified by us, as I say, there are some gremlins in there about losses which have actually taken place, so you do need to be wary on that one. A common viewpoint which one often hears in the marketplace, particularly from people like SITFA, where they've done trend analysis, which is really helpful on things like losses, and they've kind of said, so on average we reckon 4.8%, but then you've got to take account of local issues, which is kind of quite hard for you in finance to do that, because how do you work out what your local issues are? Same's true in revenues. Your revenues managers will have the same issue. So I think in terms of those local issues that I would expect, there are a couple of national issues, which if I'm not mistaken are coming, which is around the treatment of offices and non-food retail, both of which are huge sectors in the footprint of rating, by the way. And then there's whatever your local issues. So if you happen to have a big power station or a big Vodafone fibre optic network, a particular footprint on warehouses that have been underused, those sort of things locally tend to be a bit easier because they're either there or they're not, and you know about them or you don't. Next slide, please, Adrian. So the background to the material change of circumstances is MCC stands for material change of circumstance. This is a technical basis of appeal underrating, which frankly had been completely asleep for the last 3 years until COVID hit. And I'll show you the extent to which it had been asleep in just a moment. But basically, the leading counsel in this area, an outfit called Landmark Chambers in London, very well regarded rating lawyers, started to whip up business last year in early COVID by saying to all of their customers, the ratepayer agents, so here are some bright ideas about how you can litigate in COVID. And the agent community listened, because sometime around about June last year, the incidence of MCC appeals rapidly increased as the agent community started to use this technical ground as a basis, and their aim was to either dramatically reduce or remove entirely the rateable value of the hereditament. That was their end game. We're not talking about 5% off the top. They were much more ambitious than that. The whole idea here was to challenge the fundamental assessment, ideally to get it out of the list altogether. And the agents went after, amongst other things, the biggest part of the UK footprint, which was offices and non-food retail. You can imagine if you think about it just for one moment, not as a rating professional, where is the majority of England's rate base? Answer, London. Where is it in London? Answer, City and Westminster. And what is the characteristic of it? Answer, offices and non-food retail. The percentages are kind of scary. Let's not go there. But anyway, by Christmas, the Treasury had its attention drawn to this issue by London, and spent the next 2 months thinking about what to do. Next slide, please, Adrian. So the government decided to litigate, to change the legislation, I'm sorry. Just before we get to that, here's an example of an outer London borough who's one of my current clients. Let's keep them anonymous for the moment, but you can see there that the volume of appeals in 2021 was itself a massive increase. More appeals than had been made in the previous 3 years in that period, and the vast majority of them were MCC appeals. So the appeals, and that trend, by the way, is not unusual. In my other clients that I've looked at, they've all got the same broad trend. Like Dan said earlier, although I don't really have enough to formulate a sort of statistically meaningful sample yet, but the ones I've looked at are all doing the same thing, and there is a skewing of that towards London and the southeast. Now, importantly, right, and let's just focus on that 865 appeals that were made in that local authority area. If you're the agent who has made that appeal, you're almost certainly on a contingent fee basis. So notwithstanding the fact that the government later legislates to make your appeal go away, as the agent and the ratepayer, you are absolutely not incentivised to walk away from it. So even though the government have changed the law, you ain't going to withdraw it. And interestingly, the valuation office have not started refusing them yet. So next slide, please, Adrian. So the government strategy here, which you'll have got on various press releases or alerts, which will have hit you around about the 25th of March. The government decided to lay legislation. They started by bringing secondary legislation in on the 25th of March. Primary has begun. Their whole idea here, I'm heavily paraphrasing, is to say not that the regulations were wrong, but to say anything which has happened under COVID and which you might consider has affected the rateable value of the premises shall be assumed to not have happened. Kind of Alice in Wonderland kind of argument, but that's the kind of approach they've taken. It's either very, very clever or very, very risky. Not sure what yet. Next slide, please, Adrian. So I have whipped through this at inordinate speed, so it would be an absolute miracle if there aren't questions when we get to them. Also, what I've hoped to do in the last 15 minutes is kind of open up a box for you. It's not finished yet, is my view. I do not believe, whilst the government has changed the legislation, that's clear, for the reasons I've kind of hope I've explained earlier, I do not believe the agent community are incentivised to walk away from this. So what I've agreed with some of my key clients is that they will do something bizarre and let me keep looking at their valuation office data on a monthly basis. I've identified 3 test sites, 2 of which have got the right profile for the problem I've described, and 1 of which will stand up for themselves should that be required. So we'll keep looking over the next few months and we'll see. What I'm looking for are what are the agents up to now they've had their lovely little next Caribbean holiday plan drawn out from under them by the government. What are they doing as plan B? What are the VO doing with the MCC appeals, because they ain't withdrawn them yet? And what other trends can we see? Because at the end of the day, I think the agents and their ratepayer principals will be incentivised to keep chasing this one. Adrian, I hope that's kind of okay. I have whipped through it.
No, that's really, really interesting, Simon. And I know with the authorities that where I've been looking at some of their data on appeals, on the check challenge appeal, it's not easy to interpret, and I think it's really useful the way that you've overlaid that with what's happening with material change in circumstance and the way that that might influence what happens with appeals in the future. So what I found is it's very difficult to sort of relate your local experience and the data you've got and the target you might have been working towards. In many cases, that 4.8% reduction in rates. How does your local data marry up with that? So I think you're quite right. The more we can monitor it over the next year or two, I think the more useful that will be.
That's right.
That's
and
great.
if your
Thanks,
revenues people haven't yet got the VO data, then take away from this meeting as a billing authority that you should get that done.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much, Simon.
Thank you.
Just to finish off the main part of the session today, I just wanted to take you through some of the some funding updates really. Starting off by looking at the full year data, the round 12 data of the COVID financial monitoring, and then looking at the Public Accounts Committee report and some of the indications within that report about what might be happening with the funding reform package. I think that for many people in terms of financial planning, the timing and the nature of that reform package I think is going to be really, really important. So a few highlights from that round 12 data set that was released a few weeks ago. And what we saw is that monthly expenditure, whilst that had been fairly consistent across the last 12 months, there was a big spike in the amount of expenditure that was reported in March 21. And it was particularly marked in upper tier authorities. And digging down into that a little bit more, it seemed that the areas where the increase had really occurred was in children's, housing, finance and other services. Obviously from the data itself, it wasn't clear what the reasons were for that increase. I'm guessing part of it was year-end monies needing to be spent, but there may also have been some actual real pressures underlying that have caused the increases. Then in terms of expenditure per head, the amounts in different types of authority fairly similar, between about 121 and 130 pounds per head for the full year cost of COVID. Slightly lower in two-tier areas, in county areas, down at about 115 pounds per head if we had the county and the district spending together. The full year expenditure that has been reported, it was 6.8 billion, which was slightly lower than the aggregate of the monthly amounts that had been reported during the year, which suggests that the forecasts that you put forward to government were fairly accurate, and were particularly accurate actually in services like social care, where the variance was only 0.2%. Then with monthly income losses, you can see here that the peak in terms of what you were forecasting those losses would be was back in the summer of 2020, around £900 million per month. That dropped and then plateaued during most of the financial year, about £450 million per year. And the final month that was reported, in March 21, that again was around that same sort of figure. The chart on the right shows you each of the different types of income and the losses within those income types. But the aggregate monthly income loss was about 6.9 billion. In other words, that's if you add together the forecast that you actually reported to government. But the full year actual outturn was only 5.1 billion. So you can see what that suggests is that the forecast income losses that you had became less over time. Not unreasonably, you became less pessimistic, I think, collectively about what you thought was going to have to happen to income losses. And what we see, although it's not clear from the chart on the right, is that the highest full year losses were in sales fees and charges, 2.1 billion. And there were also pretty large losses reported in commercial and other income sources, 483 million commercial, 200 million pounds other income losses. You're going to get partial compensation for your sales fees and charges losses, 75% in theory, but looking at the data that was reported for the first quarter, it's under 80%, or under 50% in practice. And of course, there's no compensation at all for commercial and for other income. So there's large income sources that you're suffering large losses on. You're getting no help with those at all. Then looking at council tax and business rates in a bit more detail, we tried to piece together the various sources of data to indicate, or to sort of kind of find out what the real losses were that were going on, because different figures have been reported in different places. So if you look at the chart on the right, if you look at the aggregate monthly losses that you reported, the losses are about 6.7 billion. But as we suggested, the data suggests that those losses became, or the forecast losses became smaller during the year. So the full year actual losses that you've reported are just over £1 billion, 3.2% of council tax. But then if we look at the CTR1 report for the exceptional balance, that's down at just over 500 million, or a loss of about 1.5% on yield. My guess is that the difference between the full year actual loss and the exceptional balance is just the way that you've treated bad debts. So the amounts that you report through the monthly, well, the COVID reporting probably is the raw figure, I assume, with all the bad debts included, whereas the exceptional balance takes a view about how much of those bad debts you think you can collect. Then we've also got the QRC3 data, so that shows us the reduction in payable taxation for council tax as at the end of Q3. A fairly good indicator, you'd imagine, of what the year-end position would be. And that suggests that net losses will be about £150 million in terms of the reduction in payable taxation. And actually, because of the way the system works, we think compensation payable on that will be about 75%, will be about 150 million as well. So that, by deduction, suggests that the council tax loss, the collection loss, will be about £355 million, which is about 1.1% of yield. So you can see that, where actually the overall loss is probably less than we were expecting. If we use the exceptional balance to show that's about a reduction of 1.5%. Half a percent of that is a reduction in payable tax, and 1.1% is a reduction in collection. Then looking at business rates, we can do a similar sort of thing. We can look at what the aggregate monthly losses were, about 1.9 billion, but actually when we got to the year end, the full year actual loss was down to 1.2 billion, 4.4% of yield. But the exceptional balance was higher. That was reported as part of the NNDR1 process, and that's about 1.6 billion, or 5.9%. I think that's higher than the full year actual loss, because I think that exceptional balance will probably include a combination of an assessment of what you thought might happen on material change in circumstances, and possibly an increase in the 2017 appeals provision as well. I think that might be the difference. They're two figures that you possibly wouldn't have included within the COVID financial monitoring every month. And then the business rate losses based on the exceptional balance, and obviously we don't know what the NNDR3 position is yet, but based on the exceptional balance, that will give compensation of 75%, and losses after that will be, we'd assume, about 300 million. So councils will have to bear losses worth about 1.1%, 300 million pounds of yield. As I mentioned, we're still waiting for the NNDR3 outturn, and a few things there that I think people have been looking at in some detail as they conclude the NNDR3. Of course, the deadline is the 30th of June. One, I think, is the bad debts provision. Any increase in that provision is eligible for tax income guarantee compensation at 75%. So that's a more generous approach than the council tax TIG scheme. You will get compensation on any increase in bad debts. So there isn't that incentive to look again at the bad debts provision. I know some people are increasing or reducing the amount they think they can collect from bad debts. Some people I know are assuming they can't collect any of their outstanding bad debt provision. So I think we will see some big increases in that bad debt provision. The appeals provision, some of the data that I'm seeing, and it varies from place to place, is that the cost of check challenge appeals is higher than expected. Some places that I've seen, the losses at this point already are looking at around 4.8% of yield. So much higher than we were expecting. But I think it goes back to that point that Simon was talking about, which is that there's the difference between national trends and local trends, and also I think some of those issues around what's happened with material change in circumstances. So there is some quite significant movement there. But of course, any increase in the appeals provision for the 2017 rating list is largely reversed out for the TIG compensation scheme. You'll see there in the methodology that any increase or any change rather in that provision is reversed out, and you add back in effectively just 1 year of the outstanding balance on the whole provision. So it's slightly complicated, but largely you don't get full compensation on any increase in that appeals provision. And then just looking at the difference between the cost to local government and the amount of funding that's available, as Dan alluded to earlier in the presentation, it looks like the funding that's been given to local government in last financial year is greater by about £800 million than the actual amount of expenditure. There were earlier indications of that during the year, and the informal feedback that I've got from authorities is that is indeed the case, that actually, you probably received a bit more in funding than the actual cost that you've incurred. But of course, there are wider pressures on local government, not least from income losses. And you can see there on the right-hand side of the chart that actually the income losses that are not supported by compensation from the government are really quite significant. So that's way over £2 billion worth of cost of lost income that local government will have to source itself. And as we mentioned, the greatest losses will be from non-tax income, sales fees and charges, and commercial in particular. And these are losses where they're less consistently distributed. So that's potentially more serious for those individual authorities that are affected. So I think that'll be something that'll be interesting to see in the rest of Dan's accounts data, as you see what the effect is of uncompensated income losses hitting the accounts at year end. Just quickly looking at some of the Public Accounts Committee stuff, fair to say it was a mixed scorecard for the government's response to the pandemic. The committee acknowledged the scale of funding that had come through for local government, which is certainly the case. One of the legacies of the pandemic might be more regular financial reporting. I don't think there's much appetite to continue monthly reporting either from local government or from central government for that matter, but there is an acknowledgement that central government does need to know more about what's happening in real time in local government. We're probably a bit short of time now. I do want to finish at 11 o'clock, so I'll probably move through this fairly quickly. Just for this slide, just wanted to say that the government's been experimenting with different ways of measuring or assessing viability and sustainability, recognising the short and long-term impacts of the pandemic. They've looked at available revenue reserves, and then more generally, in the end, looking at can you actually just set a balanced budget, which in the end is I guess the ultimate way of measuring sustainability. But the Spending Review 21 will be the place in which the government will consider the longer-term consequences of the pandemic, understanding the new normal, and then working out the amount of funding that the sector needs. And then the committee urged MHCLG and Treasury to try and give authorities more certainty over their finances, and that really just means trying to give us multi-year settlements as part of the spending review. I'm not sure how easy that will be, because I think it's quite tricky just to roll over the funding allocations that we've got now into a multi-year settlement. So in terms of funding reforms, there was very clear from respondents and from the committee that the finance system's broken, and I think we've probably all recognised that. But there was consensus that reforms shouldn't be rushed, that there should be a broader review of potential reforms, potentially leading to more radical reforms. So that suggests to me, and this is kind of supported by Alex Skinner as well, that that reforms the government should take their time over the reforms, and that doesn't suggest to me that they're going to get anything fundamentally changed for 22-23. Lots of moving parts to be considered: social care, business rates, fair funding, and officials don't want to bite off some elements in isolation. So again, really does suggest that things will be put back for a year or two. But again, a lot of respondents wanted multi-year settlements following the Spending Review 21. But the question for me is, on what basis? Are we just going to roll forward the current allocations for another 1, 2 or 3 years? Do multi-year settlements preclude major reform during the spending review period? I'm not sure it does, but I think it's quite difficult for the department to balance those requirements to make changes and to give us certainty as well. So the department's promised to tell us about those reform plans during this calendar year, which again suggests that things aren't going to happen very quickly. Finally, last slide is just looking at what MHCLG are actually saying in places. I know they're canvassing for views on funding reform. Then they're speaking to some authorities and to representative groups, and they're also starting to move forward on some of the things they need to develop. Things like remoteness, for instance. I've been in conversation with them about that kind of thing. Alex Skinner's emailed out to ask for responses back about what councils would look for in terms of future funding. So I think that sort of agenda is really more about contributing to the spending review discussions rather than preparing for major reforms in 2022-23. So that's it for now. We're slightly over the 11 o'clock mark, but only by a couple of minutes. I hope that's not inconvenienced any of you who need to make a quick getaway. Just want to say thanks to Simon for his presentation, and thanks to Dan as well for that really interesting analysis of the accounts. But both really useful. So that ends the formal part of the presentations. Got half an hour now just to talk through some of those points. I can see there's a lot of chat coming through, Dan. A lot of comments about your accounts and what's going on there.
Yeah. I should say one of the things that was picked up in there was dedicated schools grants, and I've had a look at that. That's kind of given me a headache because, like the treatment of the reserves, I can see about 10 different ways of doing it, and I suppose it'll depend as to whether your dedicated schools grant is in surplus or deficit, as well as to how you treat it. But seeing different ways of treating it, whether it's in deficit and surplus. So, but yeah, some interesting stuff, and one that we'll keep an eye on and continue to work through it. I'm interested to know if people think that the collection fund adjustment account is a good proxy for the call on the general fund reserves next year, given that on LinkedIn somebody's doubted that doubted that there is any good proxy, but be interesting to know what others think on that, or what they've found at their authorities as they've doing the final accounts.
Yeah.
Any views?
Yeah. Actually, one thing I noticed from your slide, Dan, was that even when you did the adjustment, that most authorities' usable revenue reserves were still going up.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I've had a few discussions with that, and there's apparently a correlation that when times are hard, just like we all as individuals, people like to save. So I guess you take a risk position and you set aside more for anticipated future shocks, and therefore there's that. But I do wonder if there's lots of other COVID overhangs in there. I know the authority I work at, we were given new burdens funding towards the end, and we're pleasantly surprised at the size of that new burdens funding, and that'll obviously go through income and strength to the general fund balances or earmarked reserves, because we won't get to spend it, but we will spend it in future years, which means it is still artificially boosted reserves in a way that isn't really available for general expenditure. So I don't know if others are finding that, or whether people are finding the sort of technical aspects around the narrative statements, how easily that they're coping with that and being able to explain that. Because I do think there's a fear that the press will get hold of it in a way that's not particularly helpful. I'm convinced there will on investment properties as well. Any other views? Feel free to unmute and go for it.
I was going to say as well, Dan, there's just some interesting stuff in the comments there. Martin Mitchell saying that the second reading of the primary legislation is today, but also mentioning or hoping that MPs will ask during the debate when ministers will allocate the £1.5 billion pot for the new rate relief pot Sam from Manchester saying the same thing. Do we know how that's going to be allocated? But that discussion seems to have gone very quiet.
Yeah.
I know they were looking at a different sort of methodology, but they were urging you to get the money out at the same time as saying, well, we'll tell you how much you're going to get later on, which is a bizarre way of doing things, to be honest.
Yeah, and commonplace, because having the same issue with the ARG grants that we've been promised extra money, conditional on us getting the first lot of money out in accordance with their conditions, and there's a part of you that thinks, well, we want to commit that to that extra funding, but we don't want them to pull the rug from under us later on. But that's the way it's happened quite a bit over the last year, I guess.
Yeah,
a little bit, make the decisions now, and then the civil servants and the auditors come in later and change the goalposts somewhat.
Adrian, Dan, it's Roman here.
Hi, Rob.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. I just want to pick up on Dan's point about the sort of high levels of reserves, and I think that's quite worrying, because I think he's right. I think critics of local government will use that as an excuse to say things aren't as bad as they seem, but I think that's a really big misstatement. I think we're heading to a position where, by the end of September this year, furlough will be sort of wound down completely, furlough payments, and local authorities will be faced with quite high employee costs again, which will not be compensated by central government support. So they're going to have to make some fairly critical strategic financial decisions about, the levels of service they provide, and can they continue with the existing levels of staff? Are they going to reduce staff, and so on? So I think that's quite critical to sort of bring into the equation, really. What's going to happen when that happens, and how a local authority is going to respond to that. Interestingly, I mean, looking at the CIPFA guidance, I understood that CIPFA had actually said to local authorities that they've got to show in their accounts, and I know Dan has been talking about the different ways that COVID support has been shown in the accounts that he's actually looked at. But I was under the impression that CIPFA had set some guidelines that actually sort of advised authorities to show the effects of COVID support and COVID grants in their accounts as a separate item, which the council taxpayers can actually identify and see what's happened in the financial year in question. So this sort of multiplicity of different approaches is again a little bit worrying, really. There should be some more standardised approaches, and perhaps, I don't know if they're responding to CIPFA's guidance or not. So I just wondered if you'd sort of, speak about those two items that I've mentioned.
I'd agree. I'll speak to second and left round with the first round. And I absolutely agree on the consistency thing. And I mentioned those of you who subscribe to Stephen Sheen at Chabod, he sent me a statement that was a really clear statement, actually, that set out that the reserves were inflated by this impact, but explains the impact, but then tries to separate out the impact as far as is possible. And I think it's a shame, having looked at the 22 accounts, that there wasn't a set statement or a set format like you get with, I don't know, PPE notes and all the other notes to do that, because I think it is difficult to read. And I've worked on collection funds for years, and actually it took me a while, and discussing with Adrian, discussing with others, to get my head around the machinations, and I've worked with it for ages. So how when we're struggling a little bit, can you expect a reader or the members who are going to sign off these accounts to, is beyond me. And I think it would have been good to have a specific note that we could all follow that could pick that off. And it's in some feedback now in terms of trying to find that proxy for the impact of timing, and some really useful stuff there. And I will pick up a lot more on the collection fund accounts than I've ever done before, to see if we can see that, because I think it'll be important for authorities to. We're all being affected by it, but we've been affected by different degrees, as the COVID monitoring has shown. So being able to see how badly you've been affected when compared with your peers will be important, but we won't know that until all the accounts are out. So yeah, I think it's an important point. And sorry, I forgot what your first point was.
I was just talking about the reserve. The levels of reserves seem very high, but that's because I think we've had a lot of furlough support, and sort of.
Yeah.
I think what CITFA have been saying is that or what they have said allegedly is that we need to show our COVID support in local authority accounts as separately identifiable as possible, to sort of discern what's happened. Because I mean, the crucial question for me, where would local authority accounts be without the COVID support that we've received in terms of furlough, in terms of business rates, in terms of indeed reduced VAT, for our trading activities and other grants, and where would we be then? And I think that's a truer picture of what's actually happened. And indeed, our own institute, CITFA, our chief executive has said it's the best trading year we've ever had for CITFA, which I think is quite really an outrageous statement to
You've
make.
Never had it so good. That was it, wasn't
it? Exactly. Which I find utterly unbelievable. But that's a separate issue. But
that could reflect what's happening in local government generally, where some costs have gone down because the stuff you're not doing, or you've held back on stuff, and actually
travel, subsistence, all that has reduced.
Yeah.
But they're not permanent additions to base. They are just as a result COVID-driven savings. Now, when the furlough scheme ends and the COVID-driven savings diminish, we're faced with quite a big problem then. And has anyone sort of thought about what's going to happen then? That's the big issue. And people are singing sort of praises, and they're really happy, but that's not the real position, which I find really quite amazing that anybody would say that, but that's another story,
I'll do some more work on this. The two slides that I showed with the two authorities that have separated out the time difference, I think they did a good job of that. But as Ian put in the chat, the problem CITFA having just declaring the COVID thing is you've got so many COVID grants and relief. Some of them are easy to pick out, others less so. Others you will have spent to a point at 31st of March, differentially to other authorities, and some you'll be holding in reserve ready to spend fairly, probably have spent already early in 21-22. So short of being a COVID fund appropriation account like you do for investments in DSG now and annual leave, it's really difficult. And I suppose therefore it does, any guidance that could have been given would have been helpful, but it will be the narrative statement that gives the reader an opportunity to see. The problem is we don't know, because we don't know what everyone else is doing. We can only put what we think, what makes sense. And that's why I think it would have been better for the authorities to come up with some sort of consistent form, because when you read two sets of accounts, they don't read anything remotely similar to one another, and both have done the best job of trying to explain it, but it's such a complex thing to explain, so it would have been nice for somebody to step in and consistency.
I mean, have you monitored the notes to the accounts, and have they put anything in the notes about this rather than adjusting the accounts themselves? Maybe that's something they could have done.
The narrative does a really good job, albeit inconsistent between authorities, of trying to capture that. But what you get is you capture quite a bit of the uncertainty around grants that have just got in, grants that we might get in the future, whether or not that's spent and when it will be spent. So, as I say, I think the two notes that I put in the slides are really good at explaining the timing difference, but there's a heck of a load of other government grants, and then there's the set-asides that authorities have done from their own resources to build back, and the actual economic development effort to build back, as well as the public health effort. So it's a myriad of factors, really. So it's a really difficult one to see. And my biggest worry, Roman, is, which we've talked about before, is at the point where a number of authorities are under a whole load of stress. You know, the number have already got their capitalisation directions. What this is going to do is make it not look like they are under stress, because they've got this artificial, you've got a whole load of COVID monies. When they flow back out of the system, those authorities that probably need intervention around now might not get it because
they look too good,
flux. So you know, when all of this blows away, local government is still under a lot of financial stress, and it would be terrible if a few more authorities would go down the Northampton-Croydon route because we can't pick out the real position from the COVID inflated position. So it's, to me, that's more of a worry, is that we can still give a true and fair view as that we're still sustainable going forward, and it's a really difficult one to strike that balance.
Another way of looking at that, Dan, is to say that, you know, for some authorities who were close to the edge, those COVID grants that are unspent on the balance sheet will have bought them a reprieve of 1 or 2 years. They might be quite fortuitous in that sense as well. Yeah.
But someone, I don't know if it's Roman, mentioned, and I find this when you start to look at budgets, is if you look at your outturn, there's a whole load of things that we used to do when we were all in offices and we all did. They've just stopped. And when we were remote, and, you know, things like printers and paper and stationery, there's somehow, you just don't need them in the same way now. You've dealt without them. So there is an opportunity there, I think, for some authorities, and the amount we spend on premises might be different going forward. We might not need so many offices or many physical spaces as we go more virtual. So it'll be interesting in the budget to see those that adapt to, you know, particularly if you start to use an outcome focus around your budget rather than increments or way of budgeting, how you can really become leaner organisations, because necessarily you had to be over the COVID period. So some of those moving forward might be able to, I would imagine, glean more from their budgets because of the way we work. I say that from a district point of view. I think some of the social care and education pressures at upper tier probably are still there, and therefore less easy to, you know, to make a positive budgetary response to. But
just while Simon's on the call still, I just wonder, are there any questions about appeals and about valuations? Anyone having trouble with putting together the appeals provision for NMDR3? Any kind of like underlying issues that are going on? I know I've been looking in places and it's not been some of the data's not been the easiest to interpret. So I just wonder whether anyone had got any had any issues with it. I've got any burning questions.
Or is appeals just a dark art that you've got somebody in the authority that sort of sits in a darkened room and sorts out? Because that's what happens with me.
Yeah.
I think Adrian and Dan, my view is that this is quite complicated sometimes, and it's certainly not the most important or urgent thing on finance directors' desks at the moment. But at some point, it is going to get more important for people. So I quite understand why people don't necessarily know what the questions are yet, but they may well come.
Yeah, I must admit, I suppose it was something that was sort of low down on my radar recently, partly because the check challenge stuff didn't seem to be coming through very fast, and I know people were saying to me, you know, if we over provided, should we be releasing some of our provision? But then seeing some of the data that's been coming through over the last year that I wasn't really aware of, you know, for some authorities, and I don't know whether it's geographically isolated, but some of the authorities, the scale of those check challenge appeals that have come through and that have been resolved have been huge, much bigger than I was expecting, and that's going to put a lot of pressure on some authorities in the next couple of years as they sort of handle the scale of those refunds.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I'm kind of hoping that the authorities that we've agreed to do pilot exercise I described earlier, they are all Thames Valley and London, which is kind of where I think we've got the best chance of shining a light on this and getting the data out. That's not to say that all of the rest of you who aren't in Thames Valley and London won't get this issue. You will, but I think we've got the best chance of uncovering the detail where the offices and the big RV are.
Yeah, but I guess as well, Simon, that a lot of the pressure as well, or the similar sort of circumstances, will be in big cities around the country in particular. Would you say, or is it more specific than that?
No, I think it's more homogenous. And if you just think about it, not from the point of view of necessarily a rating anorak at the moment, but if you consider yourself to be a rating agent, when the legal opinions started to come out last June, if you were an agent who specialised in warehouses in the northeast, you weren't kind of going to go, oh well, I can't do that. You were going to run around your client base in the northeast explaining to them why they should take this forward. You wouldn't explain to them that they perhaps hadn't got the best case for that. So I think whilst we'll see it first in London and the southeast, I think I would be gobsmacked if that problem isn't generic, because of the fact that the agents will have been incentivized to go after it.
Yeah, I think a question from Alexandra. I think the point you're raising there is that it's because of the legislative change that's ruled out MCC type appeals. I guess some of it will come back, as Simon was saying, in other types of appeals on the current rating list. But I think the point you're making there is it'll hit the next rating list as well.
That's right.
That's right. It's a longer term impact, isn't it, on rates?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, again, I think whilst the agents could litigate with the government over their change in legislation, that would be a very long-term strategy.
Yeah.
And I think they're greedy devils, so they'll go after something much more short-term.
Yeah.
So if that means new appeals from April onwards on different grounds that are not COVID related, because they feel that has a likelihood of coming to a financial conclusion quicker than going through the Supreme Court.
Yeah. And I guess as well that the response to that, Simon, is saying, well, actually, we can't appeal on COVID grounds, but we can appeal on grounds that are indirectly related, i.e. we're not occupying the building. So
Correct.
We'll change.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I see Martin's popping in there with a view, which is quite interesting. So if you're an agent, imagine you're advising Morgan Stanley on Canary Wharf. Your potential argument is, do I sit on my hands? No. Do I argue with the government that they shouldn't have changed the legislation, which might take 5 years, or do I actually say this property post 1st of April 2021 is now not substantially in beneficial occupation because we can't use it?
Yeah.
So a completely different argument which applies from 1/4/21.
Yeah.
That I suspect is the risk.
Yeah.
Now, in relation to Martin's point, could agents litigate with regards to the government's MCC legislation? I think they could, but I think that's such a long-term strategy. And again, just by way of contrast, it took 5 years to resolve ATMs. Now, they won that in the end, but it took them 5 years.
Yeah.
It would be the same sort of time frame, and they're greedy devils. So if they can figure out something that's going to be quicker, that's their whole business model.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. But it doesn't feel like it's gone away, does it? And I think that the problem in local government is that, while the cost is not going to be apparent for maybe 12 months, 2 years, the compensation scheme will have gone by then. We'll be on our own at that point, I think. Yeah,
and I fear that those who are designing the compensation scheme don't understand enough about what the risks are here.
Yeah. I mean, there has been discussion about that compensation scheme extending over a few years, so there was less pressure to get all your losses booked into 2021 and actually maybe to be a bit more realistic about how much of your bad debts you might collect, in the knowledge that if you didn't collect as much as you'd said, then actually the compensation scheme the year after would kick in. Or that it would deal with some of the indirect implications of appeals down the line. Yeah. So that may, to be fair, that prospect might not have gone away. If problems are coming through that are connected to COVID, they may actually look again at that compensation scheme and say, well, actually, we do need to let it spill over a couple of years, but I wouldn't guarantee that or bank on it.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? Anyone want to put a hand up and have a question about anything else?
Just want to say, Adrian, when the furlough ends, what impacts do you think that will have on local authority budgets? When the furlough scheme ends, I mean, do we know how many local authority staff nationally are in furlough, and what that implications that may have for future financial strategies for local authorities?
To be honest, Roman, I don't know the answer to that. My guess is that I wouldn't have thought local government would have used furlough much, but I don't know that whether that's correct or not.
We weren't allowed to, I didn't think at the start, but I can't remember whether some arrangements where they have. I think for me, council tax support figures will be interesting because, as I think it was Ian mentioned earlier, it's not just the short-term impacts which we can pick up from the accounts, but the long-term impacts on things like council tax support and then the need for other services, as those that don't recover as quickly as others will start to manifest, which again all roads lead back to the need to have the fair funding review reset to be able to pick up some of the longer term impacts on and differential impacts on different areas. But I think they'll start to come through, and again the trick will be being able to show how there is a differential short and long term impact on authorities, because there definitely will be some. For services, and the ability to collect rates, council tax, fees and charges won't be as it was. So once the compensations go, what we're left with, will we bounce back to where we were? I suspect not, but some will, some won't.
I think it's difficult as well, Dan, to do the spending review to really understand what local government's long-term position is, or medium-term position for that matter, in the spending review, until we've probably gone through another 12 months with business rates and council tax. Difficult to do the fair funding review for the same reason, but I mean, just to finish off really, I do think something will happen. I think it'll be tricky for the government to roll over the 21-22 settlement into a multi-year set of allocations and stick with that for 2 or 3 years. I don't think that really holds water, to be honest.
And I think from the review of reserves, if you take out the inflation impact that we've talked about, you can look now every year there's 2 or 3 where you can see their direction of travel and reserves means that they're going to be of interest to the government. There are still some now that are there that are plummeting. If you look at the authorities with the lowest level of reserves and where they've come from, you could see that there's some in real trouble. The interesting thing will be to see what happens with them, because their accounts will artificially overstate their financial health because COVID has temporarily boosted cash flows and reserves. But when all of that wipes away, the same structural deficit, same financial health problems will still be there, possibly exacerbated by COVID. So at a point where you could pick that out easily, you can far less so now. So, but we should try to do that, and try to do that responsibly, not in the way that some journalists and parties have done. Yeah,
keep a level head. Yeah,
cool head.
Yeah. Well, that's great. We're at 11:30 now, so we'll shut up shop. Thanks very much, Dan. Thanks very much, Simon, for coming on, giving us that really interesting insight into what's going on with appeals and material changing circumstances. And thanks to all of you for giving us your time and your comments as well. Thank you.
Thanks.